July 7th, 1996. Watch the Daytona Beach crowd in the seconds before it happens. They're on their feet. WCW's loyalists have Scott Hall and Kevin Nash outnumbered. The Outsiders, two men who had spent 6 weeks systematically dismantling the company from the inside, are finally losing. And then Hulk Hogan arrives, and the arena makes the sound it has always made when Hulk Hogan walks through the curtain. The crowd in Daytona already knows how it ends. Hogan arrives, the tide turns. Hogan runs to the ropes like he always does, and then he drops the leg on Randy Savage. The arena goes silent. The kind of silence that only happens when thousands of people try to process the same impossible thing simultaneously. You can hear the Florida air conditioning for a full 2 seconds. And then the garbage starts falling. Cups, paper, debris, raining into the ring in sheets. Those people had grown up on Hulk Hogan. They had believed in him as children. They had bought the shirts and the figures and the vitamins and the prayers. They had constructed an entire moral architecture around what he represented. What they threw into that ring was rage. The crowd doesn't boo immediately. It takes a moment, because what just happened isn't outrage. It's the sensation of a structure collapsing. 12 years of reliable storytelling had told that crowd exactly how this scene worked. The hero arrives and saves you. That's the grammar. Hogan had enforced that grammar for so long it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a law. On July 7th, 1996, the law was repealed. Then Hogan grabbed the microphone. He looked at the crowd throwing trash at him, at the people whose ticket money and merchandise purchases and pay-per-view buys had funded everything in that building, including him, and told them they could stick it. He said he'd made wrestling. He said he'd made everyone around him rich. He said this was the new world order of professional wrestling, and there was nothing anyone could do about it.
What you gonna do when the new world organization runs wild on you? What you gonna do?
Standing in that rain of garbage without flinching, saying those things, he was right. From WrestleMania 1 in 1985 through his WWF departure in 1993, Hogan had headlined the first pay-per-view in wrestling history, sold out arenas on 3 continents, and generated merchandise revenue the WWF measured in the hundreds of millions. His image, the red and yellow, the poses, the hand cupped to the ear, had stopped belonging to wrestling and become something ambient, a piece of visual shorthand for an era. More than the money, Hogan had represented a specific promise. The good guy wins. Character matters. The hero stands tall at the end. For 12 years, hundreds of thousands of people had structured their relationship with professional wrestling around the reliability of that mythology. They had believed in Hulkamania, the way you believe in things when you are young enough that belief costs you nothing. July 7th was Hogan telling that audience, through the accumulated weight of everything he had meant to them, that the promises adults make to children about how the world works are negotiable. That the reliable narrative had only been reliable because it had been useful. That nothing structural had ever guaranteed the outcome. The New World Order was born in a Florida arena on July 7th, 1996. Inside its code, from the very first night, was the instruction that would eventually destroy the company that created it. Everything that followed was just the world catching up. Welcome back to the Monday Night War series. If you missed part 1, where I covered how the war began, and everything you're about to see grows out of that first shot, it's linked below and pinned to the NWO beat the audience's expectations. When the faction invaded a WCW broadcast, there was no entrance music, no pyrotechnics, no announcer introduction. They appeared, walking through crowds, materializing from hallways, and WCW's commentary team stopped sounding like broadcasters and started sounding like reporters covering a security breach. Authority figures arrived looking helpless. Security was overwhelmed. This was deliberate. Bischoff had identified a fundamental brittleness in the WWF's entire architecture. The WWF presented wrestling as theater, heightened, self-aware, governed by visible rules. Everyone knew the heels would cheat. Everyone knew the babyface's comeback would begin at approximately the 12-minute mark. The grammar had been absorbed so completely it had become invisible. The audience wasn't watching wrestling, they were reading it. And things you can read, you can predict. And things you can predict, you can tune out. Bischoff burned that grammar down. What replaced it was television built on manufactured chaos, unstable in texture, unplanned in appearance. The announcers responded to NWO intrusions the way actual broadcast professionals might respond to a situation outside their training. The production team executed cuts that felt like a live crew caught off guard. Nothing about the NWO's segment work belonged to the aesthetic register of professional wrestling as it had been understood. The craft underneath this was more precise than it appeared. On August 10th at Hog Wild in Sturgis, Hogan won the WCW World Heavyweight Championship and took a can of black spray paint to the title belt's faceplate. That belt carried a lineage stretching back decades, physically linked to the legacies of Ric Flair, Harley Race, Dusty Rhodes. To the audience that had grown up watching Southern wrestling, it was proof that something real had accumulated over time. Hogan painted the letters NWO across it while security stood at the edges of the ring and did nothing. The message had a specific addressee: your meaning is negotiable. Your history is something we can paint black. The NWO declared that winning and losing had never been governed by the rules the audience had accepted as governing them. Bischoff understood something the WWF hadn't. The mid-90s audience had watched institutions fail. They'd watched authority figures lie. They'd watched the moral certainties of the previous decade dissolve. The WWF was still offering order, promising the system worked, that good guys won, that the rules meant something. The NWO offered what the culture had already proven, that the rules were negotiable, that power was the only rule. Audiences believed in the NWO the way you believe in something you already knew was true. There was another weapon Bischoff deployed that fall, quieter than the spray paint and more immediately effective. Nitro aired live every Monday. Raw was taped, sometimes weeks in advance, 3 or 4 episodes recorded in a single sitting. Bischoff announced Raw's results on Nitro before they aired. The night's main event winner. The title change engineered to read as a surprise. The angle weeks in the making, dismantled in a single sentence by Tony Schiavone in front of a live audience still deciding which channel to watch. The emotional value of a pre-recorded wrestling show in 1996 lived entirely in suspense. Knowing the result before it aired killed that value completely. WCW built a ratings empire on controlled instability and information asymmetry. By fall of 1996, Nitro was pulling a 3.7 household rating against Raw's 2.4. The gap widened every week. And the further ahead WCW pulled, the more certain everyone inside the company became that they had cracked the code. They had. The problem was, they didn't understand which code they'd cracked, or what breaking it would eventually cost them. The information war, the spray paint, the manufactured chaos, these were Bischoff's instruments of dominance. But while the NWO was dismantling the main event, something else was being built in underneath. Something that had nothing to do with power, and everything to do with what professional wrestling could look like when you let it move at full speed. While the NWO was dismantling WCW's main event scene, something else was happening in the undercard that nobody had planned and nobody could have predicted. WCW had quietly assembled the most talented collection of smaller wrestlers in North American history. Rey Mysterio Jr., Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Chris Jericho, Chris Benoit, Psychosis. Men who had spent years working in Mexico and the independent circuit, developing a style of professional wrestling that American audiences had never seen at the national level. Bischoff had created the WCW Cruiserweight Championship in 1991, but it had existed mostly as a footnote. In 1996, it became something else entirely. The Cruiserweights were getting 10, 12, 15 NWO segments were designed to feel chaotic and unstable, the excitement of watching something you couldn't predict. The Cruiserweight matches produced a completely different kind of excitement. The excitement of watching people execute impossible things with precision. Where the NWO made wrestling feel dangerous, the Cruiserweights made it feel like an athletic form that could reach heights you hadn't imagined. Rey Mysterio's Nitro debut on July 8, 1996, one day after the NWO was born, announced the division's ambitions. He wrestled Dean Malenko for the Cruiserweight Championship, in a match that gave the television audience its first extended look at lucha libre technique at full speed. The crowd didn't know the moves well enough to predict them. They just watched and reacted and watched again. For a few months in 1996 and 1997, WCW was simultaneously the most culturally dominant promotion in wrestling history and the home of the best in-ring product on American television. The NWO owned the main event, the Cruiserweights owned the undercard, and the WWF had nothing on either front. Both things couldn't last. The Cruiserweights were getting time because Nitro had room for them. As the NWO expanded and the main event politics grew heavier, that room would shrink. The same company showcasing Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero in 15-minute television matches would eventually reduce them to enhancement acts for stars who didn't need enhancing. But in the fall of 1996, none of that had happened yet. The 60-minute hour had room for everything, and everything WCW was putting in it was working. Everything in the Cruiserweight division ran on trust. Trust between two athletes executing sequences at speed, trust from an audience watching something unfamiliar and choosing to follow it. The NWO understood that, and they knew exactly whom to target in order to break that trust. By September, 6 weeks into the New World Order, and WCW was about to find out what the faction was actually capable of. The NWO deployed a fake Sting to attack his own teammates during a tag match. When the real Sting appeared, WCW couldn't distinguish them. His own locker room, people who had worked beside him for a decade, chose not to trust him. Sting had been WCW's franchise player since the late 1980s, the one star who stayed when others left. Ric Flair left for the WWF in 1991, Lex Luger in 1992. Stars churned through Atlanta in a continuous cycle of politics and money. Sting stayed. Through every regime change, every failed booking experiment, every period of embarrassing television, he was the constant that made WCW feel like it stood for something, the company's conscience rendered in face paint. The fake Sting was a surgical strike against that. If the audience couldn't trust Sting, they couldn't trust anything WCW stood for. If WCW's own roster couldn't trust Sting, the company had no center to hold. At Fall Brawl, the real Sting entered War Games. He cleared the ring, methodically and violently proved he was exactly who he'd always been. Then he looked at Lex Luger and asked one question.
Is that good enough for you right there?
Wow!
Is that
Not now.
And walked out of WCW entirely. On October 21st, he came back. Long black trench coat, white face paint with black streaks. No crowd playing, no war cries, none of the hero performance that had defined him for 8 years. 7 words into the camera.
But the only thing that's for sure about Sting is nothing's for sure.
And he disappeared into the rafters, where he would stand for the next 14 months. Watching, never speaking, never fighting. The visual came directly from the 1994 film The Crow, a gothic figure in white paint and black leather, moving through the world without interacting with it. WCW built an entire production aesthetic around his absence. Dramatic rafter lighting, camera operators catching him in silhouette during other wrestlers' matches, the slow descent on a cable that became his signature. The business logic was elegant. WCW needed a counterweight to NWO dominance that cost nothing. No defeats, no vulnerability. Sting became the solution, a consequence waiting to arrive. He communicated everything without doing anything that forced a resolution. Fans projected onto him their patience, their rage, their certainty that justice was deferred but not canceled. A silent figure appearing at the edges of segments he had no business being in became the most compelling presence in professional wrestling, built entirely out of promise. WCW chose anticipation over payoff. The promise of resolution was more valuable than resolution itself. Every week Sting stood in the rafters, the audience stayed. Every week the NWO dominated without consequence, fans told themselves the reckoning was coming. The promise kept accumulating. And so did the dead. Meanwhile, the NWO wasn't standing still. Hogan, Hall, and Nash had proven the model worked. New members, new targets, new broadcasts interrupted and titles defaced. What had started as 3 men with a spray can was metastasizing, and WCW, addicted to the ratings it was generating, had made a quiet decision to let it. They would spend the next 2 years paying for that decision.
Fall of 1996, WCW was winning everything. Nitro's ratings climbed through October and November. NWO merchandise outsold everything in professional wrestling. The black and white logo appearing in hip-hop videos, professional sports locker rooms, high school hallways that had never housed a wrestling shirt before. arenas sold out, pay-per-view buy rates set records. By every visible measure, Eric Bischoff had delivered exactly what he'd promised Ted Turner. But the instruments measuring WCW's success could not measure what was happening beneath the surface. Hulk Hogan's contract contained a clause granting him approval over the outcome of every match he appeared in. Structurally, by design, the company's most powerful villain could refuse to lose. WCW's booking committee could construct whatever storylines they wanted, plan whatever narrative payoffs the craft required, but Hogan could legally decline any ending that didn't serve his interests. Professional wrestling's economic engine runs on a specific mechanical cycle. A villain ascends, dominates, then falls. The audience that has been waiting for the fall feels the catharsis of a promise kept, and that catharsis generates the revenue that funds the next cycle. The villain's dominance creates the tension, then the defeat releases it. Remove the defeat, and you don't extend the dominance, you drain the tension. An audience can wait a long time for a payoff, but only as long as it believes the payoff is structurally possible. Hogan's creative control clause made certain payoffs structurally impossible, and the tension WCW was accumulating had nowhere to go. But nobody was saying this aloud inside WCW in the fall of 1996, because the revenue made the structural problem invisible. The same logic ran through every major contract WCW had signed to build this empire. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall carried favored nations clauses automatically matching their compensation to the company's highest paid performer. When WCW acquired new stars, Nash and Hall's salaries automatically rose to match them. The more successfully WCW acquired talent, the faster its payroll inflated. Success ended up costing more than failure. WCW's booking committee operated in this environment with one hand tied behind its back. Kevin Sullivan, Terry Taylor, Dusty Rhodes, experienced wrestling minds who understood narrative construction and crowd psychology. But what they couldn't overcome was the informal power structure sitting above them. Nash and Hall had direct access to Bischoff, and the leverage that comes from being the two people most directly responsible for the company's ratings dominance. When they disagreed with a booking decision, the booking decision changed. The committee planned. The clique revised. Terry Taylor, a sharp mind who understood long-term narrative architecture, grew so frustrated that he resigned. He'd been given the responsibility of building coherent storytelling without the authority to execute it. And then the NWO started adding members. The faction's power had always rested on exclusivity. 3 men holding an entire company hostage, elite, intimidating, operating like a hostile raiding party. By September 23rd, 6 weeks after Bash at the Beach, WCW inducted Vincent, a man whose entire professional identity had been built around being someone else's subordinate, a body to fill a corner of the frame while the camera pointed at Hogan. After Vincent came a NASCAR driver, a corrupt referee, and mid-card talents whose presence made the faction larger without making it stronger. An invasion force that keeps recruiting eventually becomes an org chart. WCW had looked at the NWO's success and concluded that more NWO meant more success. But the NWO's success had been generated by scarcity, the visceral tension of 3 people holding off an entire roster through sheer force of personality. Every new member diluted that tension. Every mid-card talent who pulled on a black and white shirt made the faction slightly less threatening and slightly more bureaucratic. By the time the NWO absorbed 16 active members, it had become the thing it was supposed to be dismantling, an establishment. A power structure with internal hierarchies and supporting cast and clearly defined roles that everyone knew and nobody was surprised by.
The audience had cheered the NWO because it felt dangerous, but it was becoming a format. The merchandise was still moving, the logo still sold regardless of who wore it, the numbers were still good. And good numbers in professional wrestling have always been the most effective way to avoid looking closely at anything. The decay was quiet, but the success was real and constant and measurable. And in Stamford, Connecticut, Vince McMahon was watching all of it. desperate, financially constrained, and about to make a decision that would change what professional wrestling was allowed to show on television. The numbers from the fall of 1996 looked like a closing argument for the competition. September, Nitro 3.7, Raw 2.4. October, Nitro 3.3, Raw 1.8. November, Nitro 3.7, Raw 2.5. December, the lowest point the WWF had reached since Nitro premiered. Nitro 3.1, Raw 1.5. A gap of 1.6 rating points. Roughly 1 million additional households every Monday night choosing WCW. WCW did not lose a single week from June through February. Not one. To understand what these numbers actually meant, you need to understand how television economics worked in 1996. A rating point was a financial instrument. Networks sold advertising against projected viewership, and the price they could charge per 1,000 viewers depended on who was watching. The most commercially valuable television audience in 1996 was adults aged 18 to 49, forming household spending habits, earning more than their parents, and watching less television overall, which made capturing them more valuable per person. Advertisers paid premiums to reach them precisely because they were hard to reach. Nitro dominated that demographic for 85 consecutive weeks. The NWO had done something professional wrestling had never managed before. It had made the medium aspirational. Adults who hadn't watched since childhood were coming back. Even adults who'd never watched were watching. The audience was aging upward and broadening outward simultaneously. Among viewers 50 and above, Nitro's dominance was total. Over a 150-week span, Nitro led Raw in the 50-plus demographic 149 times. This mattered to Turner Broadcasting beyond wrestling's immediate economics. TNT existed within a cable universe where total household viewership determined a network's leverage in carriage negotiations, the deals with cable providers that determined how many homes received the channel. WCW's massive older audience inflated TNT's total viewership in ways that translated directly into corporate bargaining power. And WCW's success was making the entire Turner cable operation more valuable. The NWO merchandise had escaped the wrestling bubble entirely. The black and white logo was cool in a decade when cool was the most commercially valuable thing a property could be. Professional wrestling had not been cool in any meaningful mainstream sense since approximately 1987. In Stamford, Connecticut, the WWF's annual report told a different story. Net loss of $6.5 million for fiscal year 1997. A working capital deficiency of nearly $4 million. Immediate liabilities exceeding liquid assets. USA Network's leadership despised wrestling and privately plotted to cancel Raw entirely. The company was losing its marquee stars to WCW's guaranteed contracts and had no comparable offer to keep them or replace them. By the end of 1996, the WWF had taken out a $10 million revolving line of credit with IBJ Schroeder Business Credit Corporation, collateralized against receivables, with operational covenants that gave a bank oversight of the company's internal budgeting. Vince McMahon was running professional wrestling's most famous brand under the scrutiny of a creditor. By that point, WCW controlled professional wrestling. Completely. And because they controlled it completely, they stopped defending it. Vince McMahon had nothing left to lose. And men with nothing left to lose make decisions that men with everything to protect never would. If this series is landing for you, subscribe and hit the bell. Part 3 is already in production, and it's where everything in this video starts to unravel. You don't want to miss it. November 4th, 1996, Monday Night Raw. Steve Austin followed Brian Pillman to a suburban house. Pillman was legitimately injured, unable to compete, trapped inside his own home. On live television, Pillman produced a handgun and aimed it at the door. The broadcast cut to static. When it returned, everything was chaos. Shouting off camera, a crowd gathered on the front lawn, the grammar of a live news broadcast applied to a professional wrestling show. The USA Network was furious. Advertisers recoiled. This was exactly the content that made wrestling embarrassing to the television industry. Exactly the reason USA Network chairwoman Kay Koplovitz viewed the WWF's presence on her network as a liability to be managed rather than an asset to be cultivated. McMahon aired it anyway. The WWF in late 1996 had no institutional credibility left to protect. Razor Ramon was gone, signed to WCW, reappearing on Nitro as Scott Hall, embodying the very storyline bleeding the WWF's audience. Diesel was gone with him. Randy Savage had followed. Lex Luger had defected on Nitro's opening night, appearing on WCW television a day after working a WWF house show. What replaced them was a company with nothing to lose, making decisions that a company with something to protect never would. Every week, the WWF pushed further into territory that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. The Pillman segment was the sharpest edge of a broader creative turn that had been building since spring. The WWF's audience was changing. The people who kept showing up to Raw tapings were not responding the way they used to, were not cheering the people they were supposed to cheer, were not investing in the storylines being constructed for them. You didn't need sophisticated research to see it. You could see it in the arenas. At Survivor Series in November 1996, Madison Square Garden rejected Shawn Michaels, the WWF's chosen hero, their built star, the man they'd spent 2 years positioning as the company's next great cornerstone, and embraced Psycho Sid instead. Michaels was technically excellent, undeniably charismatic, the company's reigning champion. The crowd booed him, in favor of a man whose primary attribute was being enormous and unpredictable. The audience had decided, without asking permission, who they wanted to believe in. The promoter's script and the crowd's instinct were pointing in different directions, and there was nothing the company could do about it except acknowledge what it meant. Bret Hart returned from a 6-month contract absence and found the landscape dramatically altered. Hart was everything traditional wrestling heroism looked like at its most accomplished, an athlete of genuine excellence, a performer who had maintained his character's moral clarity through an era of mounting chaos. He came back and immediately felt the crowd's indifference. They had moved past it. He watched Steve Austin, who represented the opposite of everything Hart stood for, receive the reaction Hart had spent his entire career building toward. Austin's King of the Ring promo had happened in June. Austin 3:16 says, "I just whipped your ass." Since then, something had shifted in the audience's relationship with the company. They'd found what they actually wanted, and it was Austin's rage, Austin's refusal, Austin's contempt for the people who'd dismissed him. Something in Hart broke, slowly, then completely. In promos that blurred the line between character and genuine frustration, promos Hart has since confirmed were pulling from real anger, he turned on the audience that had abandoned him. He called out their hypocrisy. He lambasted the changing values of the country. He started winning matches by any means necessary and daring the crowd to object. It was impossible to tell where the performance ended. And eventually, it didn't matter, because the anger itself had become the performance. The moral inversion accelerating through the WWF's programming in late 1996 and early 1997 was a symptom of pressure. The company's most reliable traditionalist abandoned tradition because tradition had stopped working. The promotion's clearest good guy became its most interesting villain because goodness had stopped drawing money. The WWF was being redesigned by the weight of losing, by the mounting evidence that what it had been selling was no longer what the audience wanted to buy. Paul Heyman had been running ECW out of a 1,300-seat arena in South Philadelphia since 1993. And for most of that time, the WWF had treated it the way large institutions treat things they don't understand, with a mixture of contempt and studied indifference. Heyman's wrestlers were too violent for network television, too self-aware for traditional kayfabe, too willing to reference the real mechanics of the business to fit inside any format Vince McMahon had built his empire on. ECW was a closed circuit, a subculture, a secret. But by late 1996, the secret was leaking. The audience ECW had been cultivating, loud, knowing, allergic to being condescended to, was showing up in WWF arenas. They were the ones booing Shawn Michaels in Madison Square Garden. They were the ones cheering Steve Austin before the WWF had officially decided Austin was someone worth cheering. They had already decided what professional wrestling should feel like, and they learned it from a building in Philadelphia that Vince McMahon had spent 3 years pretending didn't exist. Heyman knew McMahon was watching. McMahon knew Heyman knew. The WWF began running ECW talent on WWF television, officially framed as an invasion angle, functionally an audition process, and the sensibilities started transferring. Not the violence, which network standards wouldn't permit, the attitude underneath it, the idea that the audience was in on it. that acknowledging the artifice made the emotion more real, that a crowd treated as intelligent would invest more deeply than a crowd being managed. The WWF didn't credit ECW for any of this. It rarely does when it borrows something that works. Steve Austin's merchandise was the WWF's highest-selling item by the end of 1996. The company was still figuring out what they had. Austin already knew. He was what the audience had already become. A man discarded and told he wasn't good enough, who came back with rage as his entire operating principle. The audience didn't want to believe in him. They wanted to be him. Stripped of comfortable mythology and marquee stars, the WWF discovered something prosperity had previously hidden. Desperation is a creative engine. Unable to afford the spectacle WCW was producing, the company launched Shotgun Saturday Night, filmed in nightclubs and bars, cramped and dark and loud, venues that cost a fraction of conventional arena rental, and accidentally produced a visual aesthetic that felt more alive than anything the company had been doing in proper buildings. The claustrophobia was the point. The rawness was the point. The WWF was building the visual language of an era it hadn't yet named. In WCW's boardrooms and production meetings, nobody was watching any of this closely. The ratings were too comfortable. The victories too consistent. There was no reason to study a wounded competitor. But the wound was healing, and the thing growing back was nothing like what had been there before. By February 1997, WCW had virtually won the war. Nitro led Raw in household ratings every week. NWO merchandise generated revenue that dwarfed anything the WWF was producing. Eric Bischoff had done everything he'd promised when he walked into Ted Turner's office and asked for Monday Night. He'd taken a company bleeding $10 million annually and turned it into an industry juggernaut. He'd beaten Vince McMahon, the man everyone in wrestling believed was unbeatable, in the one arena that mattered. Then WCW began to manage the victory instead of defend it. The distinction is invisible from inside a winning operation. When you're ahead every week, when merchandise is moving and arenas are full and demographic numbers are everything the advertising industry wants them to be, the idea that you might be doing something wrong is nearly unthinkable. WCW in early 1997 was a company that felt inevitable. But managed victories deteriorate in ways that defended victories don't. The innovation that built the NWO calcified into habit. The unpredictability that made Nitro appointment television became its own kind of predictability. A new NWO member every few weeks? Expected. An authority figure revealed as secretly sympathetic to the faction, the audience started guessing correctly in advance. Another NWO dominance segment closing the show? Understood and anticipated. The instability that had made WCW's product feel genuinely out of control had been domesticated into format. The audience kept watching. The ratings held. From inside the operation, everything appeared stable. Beneath the stability, the payroll kept inflating as favored nations clauses triggered on new acquisitions. Creative control clauses kept making certain stories impossible to tell, kept ensuring the tension WCW was so skilled at generating would never reach the release valves that gave it meaning. The roster kept expanding in ways that diluted the brand funding the expansion. The internal political structure grew more volatile as more high-paid performers with personal agendas populated the upper card. The booking committee attempted to construct coherent long-term television while Hogan revised the ending on the day of the show. Nobody inside WCW was examining the foundation because the numbers told them not to. The WWF had none of WCW's advantages and none of its constraints. No guaranteed contracts insulating stars from the consequences of poor performance. No creative control clauses protecting anyone's preferred outcome. No payroll inflated by the success of its own acquisitions. No committee trying to build television by consensus while the highest paid performers exercised informal veto power over anything they disliked. The WWF had faster decision-making and an increasingly radicalized roster of people who had been passed over, fired, or underestimated. Steve Austin had been fired by WCW via FedEx. Mick Foley had been let go after years of service. Shawn Michaels was a generational talent who had spent 1996 watching the company he'd been built to lead lose ground every single week. These were people with the specific kind of hunger that develops only after being told you aren't enough. WCW had power. The WWF had people who couldn't afford to stop. The Sting angle was 14 months old and still unresolved, and somewhere inside the audience's patience, the first threads of frustration were forming. The NWO editions had slowed, but hadn't stopped. The pay-per-view main events cycled through the same handful of performers under the same contractual constraints. Hogan was winning more than he was losing, and in a promotion built on the tension between dominance and vulnerability, that meant the tension was depleting without being replenished. Every mechanism that had produced WCW's dominance was, at different speeds, producing something else. Something the numbers weren't measuring. Something invisible from inside the winning operation. In the rafters of every WCW arena, Sting was still watching. The promise still accumulating. The debt still growing. The ending still deferred. And the longer it was deferred, the more it would cost when it finally arrived. Because it would arrive. And when it did, it would be the single most consequential night in WCW history, for all the wrong reasons. WCW had built the most dominant television product in wrestling history. They had the money, the talent, the ratings, and the momentum. What they didn't have was a plan for what comes after winning. The WWF had something simpler. A man in black trunks who didn't care about plans. A faction of degenerates who decided the rules weren't worth following. And an entire era being built in real time out of desperation and spite. Meanwhile, somewhere in the WCW locker room, an undefeated streak was taking shape without anyone planning it. The number kept climbing, and soon there was only one question everyone wanted answered. Who's next? And at the very top of WCW, in a room where the most powerful men in the company had gathered, a single finger was about to decide a title match, and set everything on a path toward doom. Part 3 is where dominance starts to cost something. If you want to be there when it happens, like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell, and I'll see you soon with Part 3.